In the news tonight, Turkish and Arab League foreign ministers denounced Israel's plan to build new settler homes in occupied Palestine, saying that would run counter to international peace efforts. Kuwaitis vote in a divisive parliamentary election held under new polling rules that triggered an opposition boycott and mass protests. And the world marks World AIDS Day, held every December 1st, to unite people across the world in the fight against HIV and commemorate people who have died from the disease. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. Here are the details. Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmed Davutoglu and Secretary General of the Arab League Nabil al-Arabi denounced Israel's plan to build thousands of new homes for its settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. Davutoglu said the Israeli plan would run counter to international efforts to resolve the conflict. Speaking at a news conference after a Turkish Arab League meeting in Istanbul, he said while the international community paves the way for peace by recognizing Palestine as a state, Israel is trying to reinforce its invasion by insisting on old policies. Davutoglu said that no matter how many Israeli settlement projects come up, the West Bank and Gaza belong to Palestinians under the 1967 Charter. Chief of the Arab League Nabil al-Arabi condemned Israel's plan as a move aimed to extend its territory, occupied territory, since 1967. Earlier, the foreign ministers at their Istanbul meeting called on Israel to reconsider its policies after the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly approved the recognition of a sovereign Palestinian state. While Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmed Davutoglu called on supporters of Israeli policies to reconsider their position, Arab foreign ministers are saying it is a must to pursue Israeli leaders at international courts because of the war crimes they have committed against Arabs in Palestine and Lebanon. Turkey's Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan said Israel should not stand against the formation of a Palestinian state, adding that despite a de facto recognition by the UN, Palestine remains under occupation. Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman defended the announcement that Israel plans to build new homes for its settlers in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. The authorization to construct 3,000 housing units and the immediate ordering of preliminary zoning and planning work came after a UN vote implicitly recognized Palestinian statehood. Speaking to a forum of dignitaries in Washington, D.C., Lieberman said the settlements will be built for national security. The United States criticized the latest expansion plan as counterproductive to the resumption of direct Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the U.S. administration has been very clear with Israel that these activities set back the cause of a negotiated peace. She argued for renewed Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, saying the United States would help whenever the two sides were ready for direct talks. After days of anti-government protests in Cairo's Tahrir Square, a big rally in support of President Mohamed Morsi took place today. At least 50,000 Islamists took part in the demonstration, but they stayed away from Tahrir Square and gathered near Cairo University, chanting, "The people want the implementation of God's law." A draft constitution recently approved by an Islamist-dominated drafting assembly is to be presented at a late hour today to the president, who should set a date for a referendum on the new constitution. Protesters, meanwhile, have camped in Tahrir Square overnight ahead of rallies by Morsi's supporters. They are protesting against the constitution hastily drafted to end a crisis over the president's expanded powers. Liberals, leftists, Christians, more moderate Muslims and others have withdrawn from the assembly, saying their voices were not being heard. The UN top human rights chief, Navi Pillay, called on Egypt's president to reconsider his constitutional declaration, saying it is in breach of the law. Pillay sent a letter to Morsi on Thursday expressing concern over the issue of human rights in Egypt, but the president has not yet answered. In the latest in Syrian crisis, military jets bombed rebel-held areas of the capital, Damascus. Residents reported clashes between rebels and troops in most populated areas of the country. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said warplanes bombed the Damascus suburbs of Kfar Sousa and Daraya. Several videos posted on the internet reported damage caused by airstrike in Daraya and showed remnants of cluster bombs that fell on the area of Mayadin in the Deir ez-Zor province. Earlier in the day, there were reports of clashes and aerial strikes in the provinces of Hims, Deir ez-Zor, Idlib, and in Aleppo. Since Thursday, clashes have been reported near the Aqraba and Babila districts on the outskirts of Damascus, which led to the international airport effectively closing the road and leading airlines to suspend their flights. Meanwhile, internet communication resumed in most parts of Syria after a blackout, which started midday on Thursday. While some believe the blackout was caused by the government to block opposition activists and rebel communications, the authorities attributed the outage to a terrorist attack or a technical fault. The Turkish and Arab League foreign ministers at their talks in Istanbul also discussed the crisis in Syria. The ministers renewed their calls for an end to the violence in the country and to deal with the tragic situation of refugees and displaced people. Kuwaitis voted today in a parliamentary election, the second this year after a series of assemblies collapsed under the weight of a power struggle between parliamentarians and the cabinet. In October, Kuwaiti Emir Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmad al-Sabah used emergency powers to change the voting system, saying his decree would fix a flawed system and maintain security and stability. Past turnouts in elections have been around 60 to 80%, but this time the numbers are expected to be lower, given the boycott by the opposition.
Polls open in Kuwait, but these parliamentary elections take place amid an opposition boycott and street protests. Some 423,000 Kuwaitis are eligible to cast ballots. That includes women who only gained the right to vote in 2005. Opposition forces in the Gulf Arab state had secured around two-thirds of the National Assembly in February elections, but the parliament was dissolved in June. This time around, opposition candidates have chosen not to stand because of a change in voting rules ordered by the emir, whose family has ruled for 250 years. On Friday, tens of thousands of Kuwaiti activists demonstrated, urging people not to vote in protest. The electoral change reduces votes per citizen from 4 to 1. The opposition, a disparate collection of Islamists, liberals and populist politicians, argue removing the additional ballots make it more difficult for them to form alliances.
In Qatar, the host of an international conference on climate, hundreds of activists from across the world marched through central Doha, demanding urgent action on the issue of climate change. They urged measures including a shift from fossil fuels that dominate the economies of OPEC nations like Qatar, greater use of solar energy, an end to nuclear power, and a shift to vegan diets as recipes for a greener future. The meeting is seeking to agree on a last-minute extension of the UN's Kyoto Protocol that legally binds countries to lower gas emissions. But few people believe the 200 nations attending will be able to agree before the protocol expires at the end of this year. Keeping Kyoto alive would be a step towards a global deal that is meant to be agreed in 2015 and start up in 2020. One group at the rally also urged greater freedom for migrant workers as Qatar prepares for a construction boom ahead of the 2022 World Cup soccer tournament it will host. But General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation is critical of the poor work conditions in Qatar and other Gulf states.
Team are standing up today for migrant workers here in Qatar. They have no rights, they have no voice, they die at work from extreme heat. Climate change will just make that worse. They live in appalling conditions and indeed they get paid poverty wages in the richest country in the world. This is 21st century enslavement of workers building this rich city. We want rights for migrant workers, we want the right to bargain collectively, a fair minimum wage, health and safety laws that protect people, and the kind of medical assistance that means people don't die at work.
The world marked World AIDS Day today, which began in 1988 and is held every December 1st to create an opportunity for people around the world to unite in the fight against HIV, show their support for people living with HIV, and to commemorate people who have died. While the number of HIV-infected people worldwide is on the decrease, some countries are making record-high cases. Health officials say awareness, government preventative programs, and the involvement of NGOs are some of the key measures in the fight against the disease. Leith Janqiti takes a look at the AIDS situation across the world.
In the Philippines, around 100 people joined a rally to mark World AIDS Day and express their solidarity with HIV/AIDS survivors. Concerned citizens, priests and Christian groups marched, then lit candles and flew lanterns symbolizing their support for people with HIV. The Philippines is one of 9 countries where the number of HIV infections are increasing by more than 25%, and it is at risk of missing one of its Millennium Development Goals of stopping the spread of the virus.
Let's get our act together. Let's be concerned about people living with HIV and people with AIDS. Kasi we cannot reduce them. They are also human beings. They need love as well as they deserve to be to love.
In China, the health ministry pledged further emergent efforts to reduce AIDS-related death rate by 30% by 2015, while reducing new occurrences by 25%. The East Asian nation, which has a population of more than 1.4 billion, reported more than 492,000 cases relating to HIV by the end of October, including 68,000 this year. The health ministry also announced that nearly 18,000 AIDS-related deaths were reported in the country from January through October this year, an increase of 8.6%. In the UK, a record number of people are living with HIV now, reaching nearly 100,000. The Health Protection Agency says there are about 96,000 people who have the virus, an all-time high. But health officials warn a quarter of people who have the human immunodeficiency virus are not aware they have been infected.
Well, this World AIDS Day, the UK will essentially reach 100,000 people living with HIV. That's quite a sad milestone. Yet in many ways there has never been a more optimistic time, because for the first time in 3 decades we have the ability to halt HIV in its tracks.
On the brighter side, and as World AIDS Day completes its 24th year, world officials say the fight against the disease continues to gain success stories. India, for one, has been a great success and a model in the fight against HIV. UNAIDS statistics show India's rate of new HIV infections fell by more than 50% between 2001 and 2009, while the global rate dropped by 25%. But the organization warns that India should not stop investment in AIDS awareness.
The worry is that a country like India will prematurely declare victory and think that it can start to reduce the money it is investing in HIV prevention and treatment and declare a premature victory. If that will happen, the virus will rebound.
For children infected with the virus, however, survival is a struggle. Many orphanages reject HIV-positive children. Children from families afflicted with HIV are often denied an education, pushed onto the street, or forced into child labor, putting them at a greater risk of contracting HIV themselves. Activists say the biases and prejudices can affect the children deeply.
You have to ensure that you work at 2 levels. One is with the school itself, the other is with the kids themselves. Because, you know, self-hatred and not feeling good about yourself is so linked to living with HIV.
The UN says that an end to the worldwide AIDS epidemic is in sight, mainly due to better access to drugs that can both treat and prevent the incurable HIV that causes it. A UN report states that worldwide, some 34 million people were living with HIV at the end of 2011, while deaths from AIDS fell to 1.7 million in 2011, down from a peak of 2.3 million in 2005 and from 1.8 million in 2010. Leith Janqiti for the News at 10.
Over to the U.S., and with barely a month left before the fiscal cliff, Republicans and Democrats remain far apart in talks to avoid tax hikes and spending cuts that threaten to throw the country back into recession. In his weekly address, U.S. President Barack Obama, speaking from a toy factory in Pennsylvania, called on both parties to come together to pass one economic measure everyone agrees on. He said Americans should urge Republicans to extend the tax cuts for all citizens but the wealthy, which would cover 98% of the public and relieve concerns over the possibility of a new recession.
So let's begin by doing what we all agree on. Both parties say we should keep middle-class taxes low. The Senate's already passed a bill to keep income taxes from going up on middle-class families. Democrats in the House are ready to do the same thing. And if we can just get a few House Republicans on board, I'll sign this bill as soon as Congress sends it my way.
The White House has completed its much-anticipated Christmas decorations made public each year. The White House released a video of the first dog roaming the different rooms and inspecting the decorations, themed Joy to All. More than 90,000 visitors are expected to make a tour of the holiday splendor at the presidential home. The decorations feature a life-sized replica of Bo, a 4-year-old Portuguese water dog wearing a Santa hat. The decor also features garland-filled hallways, 54 Christmas trees, and patriotic wreaths and ornaments to pay tribute to military families. 4 more Christmas trees feature ornaments honoring former First Ladies dating back to Jacqueline Kennedy. The largest of the trees can be seen in the Blue Room, a centerpiece of the White House's Christmas decorations. Another highlight of the tour is the White House Gingerbread House, which weighs nearly 150 kilograms and is complete with a candy replica of the First Lady's garden outside. A Missouri couple were announced as winners of half the record $587.5 million Powerball jackpot. Mark and Cindy Hill shared the Powerball payout with someone who bought a ticket at a food store in Arizona, but that winner has not yet come forward. Some states allow lottery winners to remain anonymous, but Missouri requires that the winner be publicly identified to claim the prize. They now have the choice of taking a lump sum payment of about $192.3 million before taxes or receiving half of the jackpot as an annuity in payments over 3 decades. Cindy was laid off work 2 years ago, while Mark is a mechanic at a food company. And now, after the millions, Mark wants to buy a Chevrolet and Cindy wants a horse. The couple have an adopted daughter from China, and now that they have the means, are considering adopting again. Brazil will face Japan in the opening match of next year's Confederations Cup in Brasilia on June 15th. Following today's draw, Mexico will face Italy in the same Group A. World and European champions Spain will open their campaign against South American champions Uruguay in Group B. Also in Group B is Tahiti against African champions, which will be decided on February 10th. The simple draw led to problems for the FIFA General Secretary, who originally placed Uruguay and Tahiti in the wrong slots in Group B before their positions were changed. The final takes place in Rio de Janeiro on June 30th.
So, Group A. Mexico in the Group A. Japan in the Group A. Group A.
Billy Kemper of the U.S. topped the score sheet as competitors took to the water for the second round of the Vans World Cup surfing. Waves rolled onto Sunset Beach on Hawaii's North Shore in 2.5 to 3.5 meter range, finally allowing the second round to take place. On day 3 of the competition, 96 surfers took part in the second round, with 64 advancing to the next one, including the top scorers of the first round, American Pancho Sullivan, and Australians Jay Thompson and Tom Whitaker. The Vans World Cup of Surfing is the second tournament in the 3-stop Vans Triple Crown of Surfing, with all 3 competitions held on Hawaii's famous North Shore. And finally, a quick look at the weather forecast. It continues to be cool in most regions tonight, with southeasterly light to moderate winds. Tomorrow, relatively warm weather prevails during the day and cool at night, with the appearance of high clouds. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect a pleasant weather tomorrow, with northerly moderate to fresh winds and the seas calm. Here now is a look at temperatures forecast for tonight and tomorrow. And to close is a reminder of the day's top stories. Turkish and Arab League foreign ministers denounce Israel's plan to build new settler homes in occupied Palestine, saying that would run counter to international peace efforts. Kuwaitis vote in a divisive parliamentary election held under new polling rules that triggered an opposition boycott and mass protests. And the world marks World AIDS Day, held every December 1st to unite people across the world in the fight against HIV and commemorate people who have died from the disease. And with this, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I'm Alia Tuqan. Thank you for joining us and have a good night.